Hello, my name is Sean Speer. I'm an assistant professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and the project co-director of the ON360 project, a project dedicated to bringing academic scholarship to real-world problems here in the province of Ontario. Over the past several weeks, we've been producing papers and policy papers and analysis focused on the pandemic and a post-pandemic recovery for the province of Ontario. Our most recent paper is focused on the question of navigating uncertainty in Ontario's budget. It's co-authored by me and Drew Fagan, my co-director of the ON360 project, as well as a recent Munk School graduate named Michael Sanko. The paper, amongst others, does several things. It outlines the level of uncertainty here in the province of Ontario, the impact of uncertainty on public budgets, government budgets, and some steps that the government can take to try to mitigate the impact of uncertainty on revenues and expenditures and ultimately on its overall fiscal position. We're here today to talk a bit about the paper, its analysis, and its key takeaways for policymakers and those interested in questions of government budgeting and the pandemic. Drew, thanks for joining me for today's discussion. Why don't we, I think, start with the most basic question. What is uncertainty and why should we be concerned about it in the context of government budgeting?
You know, people think of uncertainty, and thanks, Sean. People think of uncertainty as being a qualitative factor. It's something that's rather nebulous. These are uncertain times. All times are uncertain. How uncertain? One of the, the sort of policy making or statistical advances that we've had in recent years, decades, is the ability to actually quantify that, to say that these times are more uncertain than those times, and here's the evidence for that rather than it just being a feeling. And when you think about budget making or economic uncertainty, obviously there's value in being able to actually track based on evidence that degree of uncertainty. And it also helps in uncertain times and in uncertain circumstances to be able to provide scenarios looking forward with regard in uncertain times. And that's really what we focused on in the paper in the context of the Ontario government and its own policy making.
Yeah, so there's a bit to unpack there. As you say, Drew, uncertainty isn't just a rhetorical flourish. It's something that scholars and organizations have sought to measure and track over time. While there are different methodologies, these various approaches are all designed with the goal of understanding the level of uncertainty in our economy and society and how it evolves over time. And what's striking is that the level of uncertainty that's been induced by the pandemic is the highest ever recorded based on these various methodologies. In fact, it's much higher today than it was, for instance, in the 2008-2009 financial crisis, which at the time was often regarded as a period of extraordinary uncertainty. So policymakers
and higher in Canada than the United States, in fact, in recent months as well, right?
According to some of these different methodologies, yeah. That the context or the climate is highly uncertain, and as you say, this obviously has implications for policymakers in the province of Ontario and elsewhere in the country, and indeed around the world. One of the consequences, for instance, is that in February, March, when we tend to have government budgets in Canada, most Canadian governments, including here in the province of Ontario, opted to delay the release of a budget because uncertainty with regards to the pandemic was making it difficult for the government to produce an economic and fiscal outlook that would form the basis of its budget. Do you want to just talk a bit for viewers, Drew, about how uncertainty can affect government forecasting and why that's relevant when we're talking about government budgeting?
Sure. So the pandemic had, I don't think it overstated to say a, devastating, deeply negative impact in terms of the books across the country. We focused in this paper on Ontario and simply put their projections with regard to revenue for this fiscal year dropped by $10 billion. That's on a base of about 160, $150 billion. Their expenditures, their projections of expenditures rose by $20 billion. The result is a big increase in the projection with regard to the budget, with regard to the deficit. We call that the scissors effect, and you can see the reason why that's used. And and we saw that in other governments as well. Now, to a sizable extent, the government that stepped up in terms of support for individuals was the federal government, but the impact has been significant at the provincial government and municipal governments as well. So it's not surprising at the beginning of the pandemic, which is budget season in this country. Most people call it, the advent of spring. In government, you call it budget season. And that was not a moment for them to be writing a budget. It was a moment for them to be responding with regard to policy, but in an uncertain circumstance in which they really didn't know the take-up of those policies and what the impact would be on the books in a whole bunch of ways. So now we're moving, even in the second wave, into a circumstance where we're having economic updates and budgets and trying to move towards normalization. But the fundamental point is it's still not normal times. And maybe we need to think about different means of budgeting, like scenario planning that people in the working at the coalface with regard to the pandemic in the healthcare system, have been thinking about for months and months and months.
Yeah, so before we get into some steps and some processes that governments can take to mitigate uncertainty and its impact on their fiscal forecasts and fiscal projections, it's worth just emphasizing a couple of the things that you said, Drew. The first is the major fiscal impact of the pandemic that you alluded to, both the massive drop in revenue and the corresponding increase in expenditures. That happened between March and August. So in a relatively short period of time, we saw a major transformation of Ontario's public finances that, as you say, really threw the province's budgeting off course. The government had been on a path towards eliminating the deficit in 2023, 24. And of course, we now have a much larger deficit in the current fiscal year, and I suspect we'll learn when the government tables its forthcoming budget that it's affected subsequent years as well. And it's sort of intuitive for viewers thinking about these issues. Uncertainty manifests itself on the revenue side in the form of restrictions on economic activity, which brings in less revenue. And of course, on the expenditure side, we've seen governments step up to make provide major infusions of resources in our healthcare system, and other government ministries who are on the front lines of responding to the pandemic. And it's that impact on revenue on one hand and expenditures on the other hand, which is the scissor effect that you describe, and which made it difficult for the Ontario government and other governments across the country to produce a reliable set of economic and fiscal projections in March, and which has led to the decision to delay budgets up until recently. The Ontario government is now poised to table a budget, and I suspect we'll see other Canadian governments table budgets in the coming weeks and months. The challenge, of course, is, well, the level of uncertainty may be slightly lower than it was in March 2020. It's not, as you say, gone down in a marked way. The basic climate hasn't changed dramatically. So why don't you just talk a bit about, based on our research, both in terms of the academic scholarship, but also best practices as used in peer jurisdictions, what are some steps the government of Ontario and indeed governments elsewhere in the country may take to mitigate the impact of uncertainty on their economic and fiscal outlook, and in turn on their overall on their overall fiscal policy?
Yeah, so we looked at jurisdictions around the world, governments around the world in the wake of the pandemic and their fiscal planning, and looking back further as well. But in particular, with regard to, pandemic planning, like the Eurozone, for example, the 19 countries that have the euro within the European Union, those countries set out fiscal planning documents in the springtime that looked at 3 scenarios. If you're not certain with regard to the scenarios, and normally a budget has, one scenario with a little bit of wiggle room on the sidelines, maybe 1 or 2% with regard to your numbers, they set out 3 scenarios. A deeply negative scenario, it's about 12% drop in GDP, a baseline scenario that in of itself was closer to 8. It won't be that bad in the end. And an upside scenario, which was negative as well. So 3 scenarios. Other governments have done a couple. The Netherlands has been particularly innovative in this area, and others have done it in different ways. So thinking, if you don't know that there's a certain path going forward with some wiggle room, then set out scenarios and policies that respond to those scenarios, in part to ensure that you're kind of locked and loaded. And adjust, but you're ready to roll more than you would otherwise be if one scenario moves to another given circumstances over the course of months. And so we looked at a whole series of examples with there others, that worked on that basis. And again, this has become de rigueur in the course of the pandemic with regard to healthcare experts and expertise, and plenty of governments and international organizations like the IMF are suggesting the same thing for fiscal plan.
It's a really great point. So viewers will be familiar with public health officials coming out with modeling different projections on the trajectory of the virus and how it may manifest itself in our within the general population. And in effect, what you're saying is there's an ability or an opportunity to take some of that modeling and scenario planning that we've used in epidemiology and in public health and apply it to fiscal policy. So normally a government budget would be rooted in a foundation of an economic and fiscal projection that would draw in part from independent analysis. Oftentimes governments, for instance, will use projections from banks or other arm's length organizations and internal government work and analysis to produce the economic and fiscal projections that really the rest of the government's budget and fiscal policy resides upon. But the challenge is, given the level of uncertainty, because we really don't know what's going to happen in the coming weeks and months with any degree of real certitude, the risk of relying on a single set of economic and fiscal projections is they may be completely blown out of the water by events. And if so, the government's budget becomes of limited use in terms of planning. It becomes, I think, rightly the subject of critique from a credibility standpoint. Bond markets and credit rating agencies and the general population risks. You risk having an erosion of trust and confidence in the government's fiscal policy. So, rather than diminishing the level of uncertainty, one of the virtues of the scenario planning model or scenario analysis is, in effect, to lean in, to say, here's our best sense of what the baseline economic and fiscal outlook looks like, but we're going to create a range of scenarios with some with upside risk, some with downside risk, to give you the best sense of where we think we're headed, and to give us as a government the flexibility to adjust to evolving and changing circumstances. That would seem to be a prudent approach in light of what we talked about earlier, which is we are living and will ostensibly continue to live for some time in a climate of heightened uncertainty. So, I think the Ontario government can draw on, some of the experimentation we've seen in Europe and elsewhere with scenario planning, but it's just this is just I think a good governance measure or good governance approach in the type of climate we found ourselves in and will likely be for the foreseeable future. I'm sensitive, Drew, that I've kept you for some time, but I'd like to just wrap up with the question of longer term fiscal policy, fiscal sustainability, some debate occurring in Ontario and elsewhere about the role of fiscal anchors. We talked earlier about the extent to which the pandemic and its impact on revenues and expenditures has really disrupted the current government's fiscal priorities and will likely delay its elimination of the deficit for the foreseeable future. Do you want to just talk about the balancing act between, dedicating the sufficient resources to deal with the immediacy of the public health and economic crisis in the province, while at the same time keeping an eye to the longer-term questions of fiscal sustainability and the province's long-term public finances?
Yeah, happily, Sean. And we do touch on this in the paper in the Ontario context, and the the thinking around a fiscal anchor and fiscal anchors, can be various things over time. It's been a determination to eliminate a deficit, to run a surplus, to maintain a certain number with regard to debt as a share of GDP, which is what the Liberal government in Ottawa had been working towards when it changed policy in the 2015 election and started running deficits. It can be an equation with regard to interest payments in relation to various economic factors, growth and things like that. You can have a whole range of these things. I think there's a growing concern, maybe not momentarily at this moment because of the second wave, but given the size of the deficit at the federal level, to some extent at provincial levels, there will be a debate with regard to how we think about the balance between building back better and maintaining some degree of fiscal probity or, fiscal improvement as we move back to normal. And I think that's going to be a very pitched debate that's coming, given the degree to which we've gone as a country, and all countries in the West, all countries globally, have gone into deficit in order to beat back the impact, the society-wide impact, of the pandemic. One other factor that's going to be fundamental, I think, is, to grow back better. And we have written about that as well, and how important it'll be in future that we do what we can to increase growth rates responsibly with regard to climate and with regard to equality, so inclusive growth. But we're going to have to think about that, because when we go back a generation to the fight against the deficit that took place in the 1990s, a lot of that fight was won on the back of economic growth as opposed to a reduction in government spending. They used both. We're going to have to think about pro-growth policies going forward that are responsible, that's going to get us back where we want to be once this fight with the pandemic is won.
Yeah, I think those are such important points, and certainly ones that we will be pursuing over the coming weeks and months at the Ontario 360 project. We'll have a budget in Ontario and a fiscal update in Ottawa soon. As you say, I think that it's still too early to take our eye off the ball of the immediacy of the public health and economic challenges, especially in light of rising caseloads and ongoing public health concerns. But as we move into 2021, we'll probably have another provincial budget in March finding that balance between continuing to address the crisis, but turning an eye to a longer term strategy, both with respect to public finances, but as you say, as well to trying to restore economic activity, growth, innovation, productivity. These are going to be crucial, not just to the living standards of Ontarians, but also to the province's bottom line. And so, we look forward to pursuing that analysis and talking to you about it. But for now, policymakers are dealing with the crisis, and they're doing so in an environment of extraordinary uncertainty. And so, we hope that that this paper and our analysis and policy recommendations will help the government navigate uncertainty, not eliminate it, but navigate it, as we outline in the paper, and ultimately produce budget projections that can be trusted by Ontarians, but also by bond markets and credit agencies. And I would just say, in conclusion, for those of you interested in this paper or any of the work produced by the Ontario 360 Project, I'd encourage you to go to our website, on360.ca, and stay on this channel for future videos where we unpack research and analysis related to the big questions facing the province of Ontario as we collectively address the effects of the pandemic and start to turn our minds to post-pandemic recovery for the province of Ontario. Thank you, Drew, and thank you for your ongoing interest in Ontario 360.
Thanks, Sean.